Good afternoon. I'm Chris Green, Executive Editor of the Journal, a civic issues magazine published by the Kansas Leadership Center. Welcome to Trusting the Vote, a Journal live stream discussion about our voting system and dealing with distrust in elections. A question on my mind going into today was, do Kansans still trust in their elections? And it's a question that's been maybe at least partially answered by a Kansas Speaks opinion poll that was published just yesterday by the Docking Institute of Public Affairs at Fort Hays State University. The Wichita Journalism Collaborative, of which the Journal is a partner, co-sponsored the poll with the support of funding from the Wichita Community Foundation. In a survey of 520 Kansans, nearly 70% of adult residents expressed faith that winners of Kansas elections are the ones who receive the most votes. In addition, about half think that fraud is generally not a problem. Just 16% think it is. About 12% think state and local election officials commit election fraud to alter election outcomes, while 48% disagree. The poll also showed that Kansans broadly support early voting and voting by mail. They're less enthusiastic about voting drop boxes, with nearly 31% in support of banning them and 45% opposed to such a ban. They also broadly disagree that government has made it too hard to vote in Kansas. One interpretation is that the poll might suggest that Kansans are less polarized about voting about the issue of election security than they are in other parts of the country. But how solid is the foundation for that trust? We seem to be headed in a direction where that trust is going to continue to get tested. The upheavals that sprang from the 2020 presidential election have Kansans and other Americans talking about our elections this year in ways that feel very different from how it has been in past election cycles. From concerns about voter fraud and democracy to the recount of August vote on the abortion constitutional amendment, the system seems under a microscope as the 2020 midterms take place November 8th. In the midst of that constitutional amendment recount, many of us at the Journal started wondering, how much do Kansans really know about their elections and how they work? Like, what's the source of this distrust? What is it that's really dividing us on this issue? And contributors from the Journal spent the last 8 weeks digging into the election system, really diving into how it came to be, how it works, with the goal of broadening the civic knowledge of our audience. We've released an 8-part digital series called Trusting the Vote, which focuses on the perspectives of election officials, poll workers, poll agents, new voters, and even those with doubts about the integrity of the state's elections. And now we've gathered a group of them today, and we're going to talk about what we've learned. Joining me today are Journal contributors Barbara Shelley, Joel Mathis, Karen Dillon, and Mark McCormick, as well as Tabitha Lehman, who is a former Sedgwick County election commissioner who now works as an election consultant. And I want to invite you all into the conversation, which is sort of a brief introduction, and would like to hear, like, what's a question on your mind going into today's conversation that we might want to explore or try to answer. And I'd like to start off the introductions with Mark.
You would think that after about 3 years of Zoom meetings and COVID that I'd know to unmute myself before I started moving my mouth. So I'm Mark McCormick. I'm the Deputy Director of Strategic Initiatives at the ACLU of Kansas. And I'm really interested in hearing from my colleagues on the panel today about how we heal some of the divisions that are driving a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today.
Well, thank you, Mark. And I would also like to have Tabitha introduce herself. We're particularly grateful for Tabitha being here in this group of journalists to talk about these issues and to be able to draw on your expertise and experience in this conversation.
Sure, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm a nationally certified election administrator with over 20 years experience in elections. Started as a poll worker and worked my way up. Spent just shy of 10 years as the election commissioner for Sedgwick County. And since leaving that, I have been started my own business as an election consultant. I've been traveling the country assisting other election officials. And I would say that my question coming into this would be, how can election officials, election administrators, educate voters in a way to help increase trust in elections? That's always been a problem, and there's no perfect answer, but it's something that we need to keep asking.
Well, thank you. We also are fortunate to be joined by two authors who've been the lead authors of the two most read stories in journal history. I want to start with Karen Dillon, who's back with us after several years being away. We're delighted to see you again and have you working on the journal.
Thank you. Well, I've been a journalist for 4 decades and have enjoyed almost every minute of it. Not every minute, but almost every minute. And my first job out of college was in Sarasota, Florida for a couple of years. And then I jumped to the Kansas City Star, where I wrote about stories about law enforcement, city government, state government, federal government, and the environment. Then in 2013, part of the downside of the Kansas City Star, I was laid off. I went to work with the Lawrence Journal World for a couple of years. They downsized, I got laid off. And so then I started freelancing, which, as Chris noted, I've worked for Chris and Reuters and several other publications. I also, in my spare time, I guess, I don't know, but twice a year since about 2017, 2018, I've been working for the Johnson County Elections Office, as an election worker, and kind of worked up, and I'm training election workers this year. And also I'm a supervising judge on election days. And so my story is about, the doubters, the people who are questioning our elections. And I took that story because I was really interested in, why do they not, trust our system, the election system? And so that is what I was trying to find out.
And you found out something about it. Is there a question you'd like to explore today, or you think this group could dig into related to that?
I guess the question is, what does it take? What is there's something out there that would make them trust this system again? What is it? How, what is it going to take? Is it some, is it going to take a leader, somebody riding in on the white, on a white horse with white hat? What does it take for these people to believe our system again?
Well, thank you. We'll look forward to digging into that question. So Barb, take a moment to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Barb Shelley, and I'm a journalist out of Kansas City, also, like Karen, an alumna of the Kansas City Star, and happy to be writing for the Journal. I guess my question would be, and Karen, I actually didn't know that you'd done all that work as an election worker and
well, it kind of started out, just like one couple of days a year, and then all of a sudden it started. I started working, as an election worker, or and working the advanced voting, and then this year they asked me, in the spring to help train the election workers, and I said, well, sure,
That's really interesting to know that about you. So my question is, actually, Mark took my question, my real question, so I'm improvising here. My question now is, do we really think that there is a threat to Kansas elections as far as voter confidence? And do we really think, there could be a real challenge to an election result? Or are these threats that we've been hearing, are they coming from the margins? That's my question.
Yeah, and a question is, even if it comes from the margins, does that still make it a threat? Would be another one that I would put in there. Yeah, and that's a really great segue, Barb, to Joel Mathis, who also worked on, maybe a story that we were both of us were a little bit uncomfortable with. So, Joel, before we get too deep into your story, just a quick introduction and what's on your mind in terms of questions today?
My name is Joel Mathis. I am an alumni as well of the Lawrence Journal World and several other publications. I'm currently, in addition to writing for KLC, write an opinion column that appears weekly in the Wichita Eagle and Kansas City Star. I think the question I have today that I wouldn't have necessarily had until the Kansas Speaks poll came out yesterday is if we're comfortable with the level of confidence that that poll shows. 48% of adults think fraud is generally not a problem. Just 16.1% say it is. But the remainder are unsure or neutral on the issue. And so I'm curious if they haven't been thinking about it, or if they're open to the possibilities either way, and are a group that could still be captured by one side or the other, and what that then means in terms of knock-on effects for our elections.
Yeah. And like forecasting and looking forward and trying to predict what the threats are, like the threats that Barb mentioned, that was sort of your assignment for this series in the Journal. And so could you tell us a little bit about your story and what were the most surprising and interesting things you uncovered in reporting it?
The story was about whether we need to be worried about a Stop the Steal movement happening in Kansas this fall. And I think that story became a little more urgent when the abortion amendment, the Value Them Both amendment, was knocked down by like a 20% margin, I believe it was, or something close to that. And yet it was still challenged afterwards. And so, pardon me. What's going to happen if there's a much closer election? I think the one poll that I've seen regarding the gubernatorial race between Derek Schmidt and Laura Kelly shows it to be a fairly close race. So what happens if we get to the end of election night and it's either close or maybe still in question? There are a lot of things that could happen. People could challenge county level results. There could be, mass protests, that kind of thing. I think the one thing that kind of surprised me was there was concern specifically, and I think this relates back to Johnson County Sheriff Calvin Hayden, that you might see him or some other sheriffs in other jurisdictions perhaps try to participate or intervene somehow as the process moves along, but nobody really knows what that looks like because it's not something that's really happened before. And so I think that was a concern.
Yeah, and some of this reporting, I think, felt a bit uncomfortable to both of us because you sort of admit that you're sort of like a worst case scenario kind of person.
I'm a doomer kind of guy. Yeah,
doomer kind of guy. And even this felt uncomfortable trying to examine the likelihood of it. Did you leave your reporting feeling more confident or less confident that a Stop the Steal isn't something that's in the cards for Kansas?
I think it's interesting. Some of the people I talked to, I think, there are deep concerns about this, and yet people also don't want to end up being shrill and sounding that the sky is falling alarm if the sky isn't falling, and trying to find the right balance there. I left not more concerned, but still discomfited, because I think, as Patrick Miller, who's a poli-sci prof at KU, told me, he said, even if all these worst case scenarios come into play, the right people who were elected are still going to end up in office. So really what has been accomplished, that was his feeling. But as another professor from St. Louis told me, maybe the point isn't necessarily to win this election or to steal the offices back, but to undermine the integrity and the confidence in the integrity of the system over the long term. So maybe there is a Stop the Steal movement that doesn't accomplish its aims in this election, but we still have a long-term problem, and that's the thing that left me discomfited.
So I'd like to turn to Tabitha now. So having been an election commissioner like, what are you experiencing? Like, what are you thinking about with the conversations that are going on related to election security? And how surprising is it that like a publication like the Journal, which isn't necessarily known for pushing people's buttons, is like really exploring this idea of like, is election integrity going to be a long-term question in Kansas?
Well, election integrity has been a long-term question across the country. It always has been. I think back to Bush versus Gore, where we had lawsuits going all the way up to the Supreme Court to determine who was the president. And there's always going to be this conversation around elections. Elections are always going to be a subject that has to be verified. This is not just a subject where we should just trust and walk away. That's why you see post-election audits, testing of voting equipment before and after elections, all these things. And why so much of it is so transparent, who's on the voter rolls, who cast their ballots, at the precinct level, what were those ballots? All of those things are designed to create transparency in elections. But, I can certainly say that over the time that I've been involved in elections, this conversation has changed. As I discussed in the article that Joel wrote, I was sued multiple times by a statistician from WSU who was convinced the voting machines were rigged. I was vilified in the press, honestly, quite frequently, because they felt I was not being transparent, even though each one of those lawsuits proved that I was following the law. I was still vilified. And ultimately, that those lawsuits actually led to us having post-election audits in Kansas. But, you saw this groundwork specifically within the conservatives within Trump, I'll just call it out, prior to 2016, when he started using rhetoric like the only way I'll lose is if it's rigged. But ironically, after 2016, I didn't get a lot of flack or questions from Trump campaign people. What I got was from Hillary's campaign and supporters who were convinced that she didn't lose. And so this is not unique. Over the years, we've seen it seemed like every election, there's always at least one candidate who was convinced they didn't actually lose, and that it was because something nefarious went on. But what is new is this becoming a national talking point and it becoming an accepted rhetoric that's used within a political party. And that you have a sitting or now formal president using this as a catalyst to try and overturn election results that have been correctly and duly certified. And so while this isn't new in Kansas, it's certainly a lot worse. And I think that we're going to continue to see it get worse. I think the point that was made that this is a long-term game is very valid. I think this is more focused on the 2024 presidential election than it is the 2022 midterms. And that's not going to go away. And my fear is what we're going to see. We're already started seeing it happen in Kansas and in other states, but I think it's just going to get worse, is that just burnout by experienced good election officials who are going to continue leaving the field. People who were already overworked and underfunded and understaffed now they're just so overrun with open records requests. I mean, some of the numbers I'm seeing in news articles, I just can't even imagine. Now when I'm doing work for someone and I need to ask my local election office for data, I just cringe before I submit an open records request because I know they're already overrun, and I hate contributing to that, but I have to have the data to do my job. So, I'm concerned that this is going to have very long lasting impact on the field of election administration, where we're going to end up with so many people who don't know what they're doing, and it's going to have a detrimental impact for the voters.
But are you able to offer a perspective? So you've seen these concerns emerge over time, but you've seen them come from the left as well as the right, which suggest something systemic or something that we all have a part of the mess in. Where do you think this comes from? Where does this distrust originate? Or is that beyond what you can see from being an election commissioner?
Well, a couple of candidates, I believe it was just that unwillingness to accept that people just didn't want them in office. And there were certainly a couple people like that. Or something minor would happen and they would latch onto that as that's why I lost the election. No. You getting your data, 15 minutes later than your a person running against you didn't affect the outcome of the election, or whatever their complaint was, And so it's just I think some of it is just that. I think most of my term in office, that's what it was. And now I just think it's a lot more nefarious. I think it's that people are trusting the wrong individuals for their data. I said this to a reporter yesterday who was interviewing me, that you can stare at a pink elephant and say it's orange all you want, but it doesn't change that elephant into being orange. It's still pink. You can look at it. You can look at it as a colorblind person and it may look orange, but that doesn't mean it's orange. You can put glasses on that change the color and look at it through those lenses and it still looks orange, but it's not, it's pink. And that's where I feel like when I'm trying to explain the election process to so many of these individuals who believe what they're being told by individuals who either have nefarious reasons for doing this or simply are so uninformed and don't understand how the process works.
So from your perspective of someone who has so much experience in Kansas elections, like, should Kansans trust the process? Should we trust that how we vote is accurate?
Absolutely. In the primary, I voted by mail and I put my ballot in a drop box. So, and that's after 20 years of election experience in Kansas. I trust the process. There are humans involved and mistakes happen. And but I think the point that was already been made is that we have proper protections in place to correct those mistakes before the vote's certified, where we have post-election audits where we check and balance things. And so I trust the process and, again, been involved in it for 20 years. So.
Well, thank you. I'd like to turn to Karen now. We haven't published your story yet about, the thinking of election doubters, but that will come next week. But I was hoping you could give us a sneak preview of what you learned and what's the story that they tell about our elections, and why do they feel so strongly that things can't be trusted?
Well, I spent several weeks on this story, as we all have spent on our individual stories, and I talked to several people, and most of them, their doubts really became solidified the night of the Trump election, or the 2020 election when Trump lost. And they go on to tell us that they watched that throughout the night, and they think some very nefarious things occurred. And then when Trump came out, told America that he was winning the election, when he was actually losing, they truly believed that something had gone wrong with the system. Trump said, this is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country, or we're getting ready to win this election. And frankly, we did win the election, but now they're saying that we didn't. And so that really set off these people. And their feelings seem to be really profound. I mean, they're deep, that there's something wrong with this election system. And so, the people I talked to, some of them have been involved in these lawsuits that they've been filing against election offices and against Scott Schwab, Secretary of State. They've been involved in that. There's some people who aren't involved in it, but all of them believe there's something wrong with not just Kansas, but with the country. And one woman believes that God has set her on this path, to try to rectify the problem, and she's teaching other women, older women, how to, do FOI requests or freedom of information requests and sunshine requests and so forth, trying to get all this data and pull together. Another woman who's been helping file these lawsuits says that, her evidence is hard, it's real, and that, that her lawsuits have been dismissed not because of her evidence and her facts, but because she lacks standing, that she isn't representing all the population, but just herself, or just a few. So I came away, I think I'm just about as mystified as I was going into it. I was eager to go into this and try to figure out, what is it that would change their minds? What would make them trust, our election system again? Is there something? And they say they're not going to be happy until that we all vote on paper. They want to do away with all the machines, be done with those mail-in ballots. All that should be gone, even though there's paper that everybody has to show up, sort of like in Missouri, I guess, because I think it's still that way, but they do use machines in Missouri. But just paper. And, I don't know if they go back and look in history and look at like 1948 and, Lyndon B. Johnson's election to be senator in Texas, and how that election was stolen was all on paper. And, even after the election date was over, they still came up with new ballots on paper. And, I'm just as mystified as, as when I started this story, because I don't know, they just truly profoundly believe that our elections are fraud. And they started off with the 2020, and they said, then of course they felt there was something wrong with our August primary. They think that there's something wrong with all the elections going back to I guess 2003. I think it was a year that they cited. So I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. And I'm mystified.
I also thought it was interesting.
I'm sorry, Chris.
No, go ahead, Mark.
Question for Karen. This is Mark. For the people that you were interviewing, how did they reconcile the fact that there were a number of Republicans who won elections, even though President Trump didn't win re-election? How do they reconcile those things?
They don't. I mean, they just don't. They don't tend to reconcile anything. What they decide and what they're being told. These people are on social media, and like the one woman, she has somebody, I don't know who it is, but there was somebody who's helping her to file these cases. I think they think there's just something out there that people are against Trump, and so people elected Republicans, but people, but there's a lot of hate, animosity regarding Trump. And so they think that something specifically is going wrong with that. Doesn't it, and he had his own race. These other people had their own race. These other Republicans had their own race, and somehow, it's corrupt.
I also thought it was
Wasn't
interesting.
on the ballot every election going back to 2003, though.
Pardon? Oh yeah, I know, but they have now, and it's part of the social media and the people they're talking to, and they're from all over the country. The pillow guy is a big deal to them. I mean, he's like, as I say in the story, he's a folk hero to them. Obviously, I guess most of us know that he's out spewing quite a bit of rhetoric on fake elections and fake, that the elections are corrupted. So yeah, it's interesting. Chris.
Yeah, I also thought it was interesting that in the course of your reporting, you found people who trust Kansas elections, but also watch the documentary 2000 Mules and have a lot of distrust in national elections.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, this couple, they were a genuine couple. I mean, they were very sweet. I met them over in Upland Park at a meeting, and they truly, they truly believe that in other states that were addressed in this film, that there's a serious, horrible problem, deep problem in their election system. But they don't believe that it is a problem here in Kansas, because Secretary of State Scott Schwab told them personally there wasn't a problem and explained why there wasn't a problem, which those reasons are all in my story. And they truly trust him. They believe him. They think he's just really, really a great election official. And they do say that. But they don't think there's anything wrong in Kansas with the election system, but it's in all these other states that have problems that were addressed in that film. And they watched the film twice because they were so taken by it and how horrible the situation was.
Well, and I don't know what to make of that, if that is a good thing that they trust in Kansas elections, or how disquieted I should be by the fact that they think it's so different in other states.
Yes.
I'm interested, like Barb, in your perspective. So like your assignment on this was kind of an unusual one. Like we sort of asked you to widen the lens and like figure out like, well, how did Kansas get the election laws it does have?
Right, and I was interested in doing that story in part because I actually live in Missouri, 2 blocks from the state line. And, you know, all my friends in Kansas are out weeks before the election, advance voting or mail-in voting. And only this year did we get, 2 weeks of no excuse absentee voting in Missouri. And frankly, I'm not even sure where we go to do that. So I'll probably just do what I always do and trudge down to the local polling place on election day. But it's way different in Kansas, and it turns out that Kansas history is very much in favor of access for voters, not only in the ways that you vote, but also, they started opening up voting to different groups really back in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. They got absentee balloting for soldiers. It was called the Soldier Voter Law. And then they did the same thing for railroad workers who might be away from their polling place on election day. And so, starting in the 1860s, you just have this long arc of accessibility for voters. And, women were voting in Kansas before we passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. For a while, non-citizens could vote in Kansas. All they had to do was say, oh, I plan to become a US citizen. And they were able to vote. Kansas was not the first state to have the open advance voting that you have right now, but it was pretty early on in the 1990s when you got that. And Tabitha, I don't know if you were actually doing elections when that happened.
What?
In 1996.
Who, me?
Oh,
Okay.
No,
Sorry.
not yet, but I will say that, I know that Johnson and Sedgwick County were the first ones who were able to do advanced vote sites instead of only at the election office. And I will just mention, Barb, because I've done work in Missouri, you go to your county election office to vote, and they may also have some satellite early voting sites. So there's your information for Missouri.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But yeah, it started out as a Sedgwick and Johnson thing because they were larger, and then it was expanded to the rest of the state where they could open satellite early voting as well.
And one of the fun things I learned while researching this is a lot of the push for advance voting in Kansas came from the 1992 election in Johnson County because it was a mess. There were just long lines. People were voting at midnight. There are a lot of newspaper articles about it. But it was pretty easy to fix the law. They just changed the word absentee voting to advance voting, a one-word change. And it just meant that, we don't care where you're going to be on election day. You can just come and vote advance. And I talked to Connie Schmidt, who was the Johnson County election commissioner back then, and she's been around so long. And she said people were so grateful when they started advance voting. And they said, I just came in here and 15 minutes later, I'm out, and it's so easy. I can't believe we can actually do this. I actually I heard somebody being interviewed last week when they started advance voting in Johnson County, and she said the same thing. All these years later, this is just great to be able to do this. And I think the support for that kind of openness is still very, very strong in Kansas. You haven't seen too many Republicans who have been able to bring themselves to want to roll back the clock on advanced voting. Drop boxes, yes, but not advanced voting. However, this long arc of progressive legislation for voting in Kansas did kind of derail around 2010. And a lot of that had to do with Chris Kobach and his running for offices, and on the platform that there was something wrong with elections in Kansas. And, his thing to start with was that, you had a flood of non-citizens voting. And somehow that kind of got under the skin of the whole Kansas election system. And, to the point where, now the groups that rate elections as far as openness don't give Kansas a high grade. Now, there are groups out there that like to rate states in terms of, quote, election security, and they are giving Kansas ever improving grades because of some of the legislation that's come out over the last few years.
And if I remember correctly, so the big changes during this period of time was the implementation of voter ID, which is still around and broadly popular and has bipartisan support. And then there was the citizenship verification element that did not stick around because of the court system. Do I have that right?
Yeah, pretty much. And that citizen verification was a really draconian move, and as people that are here listening to this probably know, it created havoc because at motor vehicle offices, they were being told, based on federal law, hey, you can register right here and you don't need your proof of citizenship with you. And then people were getting disqualified at the local election offices because the local election officers didn't have their proof of citizenship. And that did not hold up in the courts. And in fact, Mr. Kobach really came across looking pretty bad in that whole thing. The judge told him he had to go back to class to, beef up on some of his legal theories.
Barb, I want to ask, how much of that toughening of voter laws, how much of that is about truly strengthening election security and how much of that is about winning elections? I was in Pennsylvania in 2012 when they passed a voter ID law, and it became a thing that one of the Republicans there said, we passed this voter ID law that's going to get Mitt Romney elected. So that made it seem like it was more about winning elections than about actually protecting election integrity. I'm curious where your impression is as regards Kansas law.
Well, I mean, it's always been mostly legislators from one party that drive voter ID laws. I've watched Kansas and Missouri legislatures for a long time, and I've never seen a Democrat go out front to sponsor voter ID legislation. So I do think there is some reason to think that it's an advantage to the Republican Party because of the people who would not likely have government issued photo IDs, college students, minority groups, Latino, Black, so yeah, I think it started out as kind of a tool for one side. I know exactly the quote you're talking about from Pennsylvania. But I think now, of all the things that are passed, it's kind of not considered too radical anymore. I mean, you do have to produce a driver's license for a lot of things. So as long as states have some flexibility with it, that you can, if you show up without your voter ID, you can come back or cast a provisional ballot or whatever. I think that's not one of the more concerning things that we're seeing as far as election security right now.
Yeah.
Well, and if I could, I'd like to jump in here because I actually lived those laws. My first election out as election commissioner was the first election in the state under Kansas's voter ID laws. And then I was there for the implementation of proof of citizenship. I was called to court as a witness and testified and cross-examined by the ACLU. Thank you, Mark McCormick, at significantly because of the non-citizens who had registered to vote in Sedgwick County, who I would just mention, I think over 80% of them, I think it was, I don't have the documents anymore, but if my memory serves me correct, registered to vote in person at a DMV, and a government agent registered them. So in my opinion, we should have been going after those government agents, because if I was in a foreign country and I walked up to a government official, I was at a government agency and they said, hey, do you want to register to vote? My first thought wouldn't be, oh, I can't do that. But that's a whole nother conversation. But I would say, and so I was appointed 3 times by Chris Kobach. And while I would say we don't agree on many things, I don't think I ever heard a word out of his mouth in this arena where his desire was to keep people from voting. He genuinely was trying to secure our elections, and love him or hate him, I think he gets a bad rap for saying he was trying to keep people from voting, because that I was in on many conversations in prepping for all these things where he could have easily said those words, and I never once heard that or got that impression from him. So I will defend him and on that subject, because I do not believe that's his heart.
To jump in and say that, it's just not a driver's license that you need or a state ID. You can use a government employee ID or a tribal ID, or there's a number of, I think, college ID. There's a number of IDs that can be used, to vote. So I think that they just don't focus on just a state ID, and a driver's license ID is pretty good. That's wider than just the 2.
And if you can't get it, there is a path in Kansas for you to get a free ID through the Secretary of State's office, just for voting purposes.
Well, thank you all. So I imagine that a lot of people watching this live stream are people who are routine voters, who are experienced voters. I imagine that most of us in this panel are people who voting are a regular part of our experience. But one of our columnists, Amanda Vega-Mavic, through her interactions, got together with a group of people who that wasn't their story. And Amanda couldn't join us here today, but she did do a short video interview with me to sort of discuss her experience of talking to a group of 15 women who were new to voting, and kind of what she learned and what she took from that experience. And we're going to play that for you now.
I'm Amanda Vega-Mavic, and I'm a columnist for the Journal. I also work in early childhood education and trying to be as civically as engaged as I possibly can in my community. My family had a huge impact on my own attitudes and beliefs around voting. Mom and Dad just made sure we knew the process. They would explain everything to us. And we just grew up with this idea that there was never any question that as soon as we were old enough, we would vote. We would, do everything that we could when it came to voting. When I realized Kansas was home and I was a registered voter in Kansas, I started, again, just getting myself informed, making sure I knew what was going on. And, with a couple of friends would talk about, how do we help people make sure to vote? And so this idea of voting and being informed and encouraging other people to vote was just sort of always on my mind. And I found myself among a group of women, and the 2020 presidential election was coming up, and I remember saying something pretty nonchalant of like, okay, everybody have a voting plan, everybody know what they're doing, or just I don't even remember the exact moment it happened, but the responses that I got, I realized there was about 15 of us in the group, and I realized that very few of them actually had a voting plan. And as I started having smaller conversations with them here and there, realized that a few of them weren't even sure if they were registered to vote. A couple of them knew they were registered to vote, but had never voted before. And some of them, it struck me. I was surprised that not everybody's voting experiences had been like mine. Not everybody was ready to go do it and knew what to do. And so from there, it became kind of what's turned into a bit of an annual process of helping, making sure that we have voting plans, that we're informed, that we know where to find information, and so that we can get to the polls and be informed, knowledgeable voters. When I went back and had conversations with them, definitely feelings of, well, my vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter. What's one vote? Some of them also, the information and the language barrier was a big contributing factor to why they wouldn't vote. One of them said, I want the information in Spanish. I want to make sure I know what I'm doing. And with this particular person, the case in point was this summer when Kansas was voting on the constitutional amendment, I remember. And so we kind of gone through this process of me helping her be an informed voter in previous elections. And she came to me and said, I need you to help me find the information in Spanish, because I know it's important and I'm going to go vote, but I need to make sure I'm checking the right thing, but I need the information in Spanish. And so that was a recurring theme in our conversations, was I just want clear, simple, direct, nonpartisan information that I can use to make a decision. I remember in another conversation, one of the women said, well, I never voted because all I had was the TV or the radio and everything's negative. She's like, you don't know, they're all talked about poorly. And so it doesn't seem like any candidate necessarily stands out as the right one for me or something else. But they had also gotten to a point where they realized the other recurring thing that came up was, as Latinos, they wanted to make sure that they were doing what they could to elect candidates and make decisions that would affect the Latino community. And the Latino community is not a monolith. Like, we don't all think the same. We all have varying opinions and attitudes towards things. But things that were happening to the Latino community, that were affecting them, they wanted to be able to have a voice in that. For several of the women, they are naturalized citizens. And so that was the other thing, was they realized, again, in the Latino community, we don't all have the right to vote. And so this idea of, I need to do my part for the community. I need to give that one vote and hope that that one vote makes a difference for the things that are affecting our community. And so it's been a wonderful experience since that 2020 presidential election. And here we are 2 years later and gearing up for the midterm elections here in November, and having conversations and seeking out information. And it's just, they're different conversations now as we get ready to vote here in just a few weeks. Sample ballots. Sample ballots. They are wonderful. There's a couple different sites. I think, again, depending on where you live, where you can get a sample ballot pretty quickly and pretty easily. And so we'll print those out and then usually flip it to the back so they see, hey, there's more to there's more than just those first couple of races, and all of them are important. And that's also been part of the conversation is, it's because I would hear that too. Well, I don't know who any of these people are. Or I don't know what does this matter? What does that matter? And so just also explaining the connection between those local races or things like the state amendment and not just the president. That's, of course, everybody's ready to vote for that, but also just talking about who are your city council people, who are your state senators, who are your state representatives, those races as well, and what they do for us on a daily basis, and how we are more impacted by the decisions and the advocacy that they do than some of these other things. Don't ever assume anything, which I think kind of goes without saying in a sense, but I think don't assume. I think that was like, again, when I remember asking that first time and I was shocked by, I'm like, oh, okay. So like nobody has a plan. Nobody's really thought about, again, some of these other races. I think just don't assume that even the people in your closest circle are going to go vote or know how to be an informed voter. And I think also remembering that we tend to trust our friends, right? Our family and our friends more than we're going to trust, again, other sources. And so the power of a short conversation with somebody and the power of asking a question and seeing where it goes. And then if you are that person that has access or knows about resources, to share that information. But I think, again, it's not about telling people how to vote. It's, or who to vote for is what I mean by that statement. But it's just about getting people engaged, because, to this day, I remember thinking, I wonder how that person's voting. And oh man, I really want to ask, but I can't. Like that's not my business. All I know is she's going to go vote. And that's the important part.
Well, we're grateful to Amanda for sharing that story and being willing to talk about her experience, because I think it shed a light on an experience that maybe I was a little disconnected from. So we have one final panelist, Mark McCormick. So Mark, you wrote a column in the lead up to the elections, sort of focused on civic knowledge and a desire to really be informed and really sort of rebuild this trust and knowledge we have in civic infrastructure. So I'm curious, having written that and having heard all that you heard today, what's on your mind right now when it comes to the civic moment that we're experiencing?
In true KLC fashion, I feel like what we need to decide is what aspect of this is adaptive. And I think, I don't think I'm alone here, because I've heard other people say this, including people like John Meacham, who talks about us being in the middle of a culture war. That someone asked him, what era did he feel like this current era reminded him of? And he said, I think we're in the 1850s, where the culture was pulling itself apart, over certain issues. Years ago, I got to meet Frank DeFord, the great sports writer for Sports Illustrated. He used to do commentaries on public radio as well, but he talked about how years ago in sports, it didn't matter if you won or lost, but how you played the game. And then Vince Lombardi came around and said, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. And he said, today it's in your face. That's how coarse the culture has become. And I think the coarseness of that culture has an expression in some of these issues that we're talking about today. The tribalism. If my team wins, then I think the voting system is okay. If everything doesn't go exactly the way I think it is, then there's a problem with the voting system. And, I was thinking about something that Joel had mentioned earlier about not wanting to be alarmist about this. I've often wondered, though, if we haven't been alarmist enough when we're talking about the fundamental idea about our democracy. You know, the expression of citizens comes through voting, and it's frightening that we have the numbers of people who do not believe that our elections are well run, well staffed, and professionally run. You know, we were lucky in this state for a long time to have people like Tabitha, who were real professionals in how they ran elections. And we should have a particular affinity for voting rights in this state. And I've talked about this guy a lot, but there was a Unitarian Universalist minister who was actually from Wichita, who was born in Wichita, who was killed in Selma over voting rights. And because he was marching with Black people, the hospital wouldn't treat him. He ended up dying at another hospital. I believe it was in Nashville, a couple of days after his attack in Selma. And Martin Luther King gave his eulogy. A lot of that fervor from that era, it feels like it has returned with a vengeance, where, you know, neighbors don't really care for neighbors, and that we feel deeply divided into these tribes. And I think that's what we're going to have to work through and embrace this idea about democracy. And when I talk about democracy, I'm not talking about voting per se. I'm talking about the idea that people belong. The root of that word is the people. And on a democracy, everyone should matter. Everyone should be a stakeholder, and that there have been concerted efforts from the beginning to make sure that there are certain groups that couldn't vote. When the Constitution was signed, only 7% of the population could vote. And while we allowed women to vote here in Kansas, according to our Constitution, they were only allowed to vote in school elections. That's really been a battle. And what we have found here fighting voter suppression efforts is that when you put small barriers in front of people, it does prevent them from voting. And that when you remove those barriers, people demonstrate that they really do want to participate and they do really want to vote. So what we have to come to grips with as a society is, do we really believe in democracy? Do we really believe that everyone has a stake, that everyone should be involved, and that we're not about casting people out whose ideas that we don't like? We should allow those ideas to surface. We should fight on the basis of those ideas, and hope that, you know, our intellect wins the day, as opposed to some of the other paths that people want us on.
Well, thank you, Mark. And that's you sort of took it in the direction of leadership, and the journal is published by a leadership center that tries to teach people to exercise leadership. I'm curious, with just the couple of minutes that we have left, our panelist, what kind of leadership do you see this moment calling for? What kind of leadership would it take to advance greater trust in our elections and greater trust in our democracy, that everybody is represented?
There's one more thing I wanted to mention. I saw a story in the Washington Post earlier this month, and I printed out a portion of it. But the Post was talking about how there are 291 Republican election deniers on the ballot across the country, and 171 of them are favored to win. Mm-hmm. This is really our challenge. Can we really have people who don't believe in democracy in our elections actually running elections or actually serving in public office? Those are some of the questions we're going to have to address as a populace.
Yeah. And I think it's going to have to come from elected leaders. I think Kansas is fortunate to have a Secretary of State who will not back down and say there's something wrong with Kansas election systems, despite pressure in his party to do so. And I think it's going to take elected officials of both parties to stand up and do the same thing.
I 100% agree with Barbara, and I would take it a step further and say that it shouldn't be Scott Schwab as the sole Republican out there saying this is secure. I have been a registered Republican since the day I registered to vote when I turned 18. And just a couple of weeks ago, I unaffiliated. And I unaffiliated because I will no longer be part of a party who will not stand up against bullies and manipulators and speak the truth. And they're not speaking the truth nationally. They're not speaking it at the state level, and they're not speaking it here in Sedgwick County. And I will not have my name associated with this party anymore. And I realize I am probably making a lot of enemies at this moment, but we have to stand up for the truth. And when the party has been given so many opportunities to do so, the moment that this rhetoric started, the Republican Party should have been saying, wait, you have to have viable, actual proof before we're going to jump on this bandwagon. But they're pandering to people instead of standing up for what's right and what's true. And I could no longer be part of it. So I would add that it should not be Scott Schwab alone. That is unconscionable that he's out there, the only one speaking the truth.
You see, Chris, this is why I'm such a big Tabitha Lehman fan. That we have to have people who decide on the side of democracy in our country, as opposed to these tribes that we're in and fighting these proxy wars, based on what tribe we're in.
Well, I think we have come to the conclusion of our time together today. I want to thank you for joining us for today's discussion. It feels like an appropriate place to end it. We hope to continue our journey together, and we'll continue covering these conversations. Hang around after the credits. There will be a video trailer promoting KLC's latest book. And beyond that, let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, I'm Chris Green.
When Everyone Leads, a new book from the Kansas Leadership Center that's not about leadership, or at least in the way we normally think. Available soon at your favorite bookseller.
You don't need a title to start leading.
Leadership is not a position or authority.
Leadership isn't being the boss.
Leadership is an activity.
Leadership is a practice. It's asking powerful questions and making multiple interpretations.
It's about taking smart risks when meeting a challenge.
When everyone leads, more people pay attention to what's most important.
When everyone leads, we stop depending on the person in authority.
When everyone leads, we seize our leadership moments.
When everyone leads.
When everyone leads.
When everyone leads.
The toughest challenges
get seen and solved.
When Everyone Leads. Available January 31st. Pre-order your copy today.